Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I am going to be joined very shortly by Mary Harb, and we are going to be talking about Muhammad and his wives, and you're going to learn some stuff that the Dawagandists don't want to tell you, won't tell you, or don't even know themselves. If you like what I'm doing, and if you want to support the evangelism that I'm doing, all the links are in the description box below. I'm feeling a little under the weather and probably a little low energy, so that's probably, you're going to pick up on that. However, I know that Mary Harb is bursting with enthusiasm to talk about this topic. So without much further ado, I'm going to bring her on. Peace be with Mary. How are you?
I am very well today. Thank you. And
good,
hello
good.
to everybody. Most of them are new faces for me.
I am sure many of them probably know you from other channels with Thaddeus's Reason and Theology, which we'd like to promote. It is Reason and Theology, right? I got it named right.
No, it's Reasoned Answers.
Reasoned Answers. Oh,
Reasoned Answers Apologetics.
Yes, I'm terrible with names. Reasoned Answers. So Thaddeus, a bunch of people probably know you from that. So it's good to have you on. As always, we're going to start with a psalm as a prayer, and then I believe you've got a presentation to make to us.
Indeed.
Okay.
I'm reading Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure, and build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then will you delight in right sacrifices, in the burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Read at Coptic speed there. So let's bring in your presentation.
All right.
And at this point, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'll just jump in wherever I feel I need to. And I know that you've got more than enough material to talk for 2 hours solid. So
yes, and I'm doing I'm going to be breezing through this first part because I want to get to Muhammad's actual family. So we are not spending any time on any of these slides, guys. So buckle up.
All right, guys. Carry on. Go on, Mary.
The origin of Arabs and Hebrews and all of the Semitic peoples are from the Afro-Asiatic and Semitic language group. You can see here where they're distributed now. After our original ancestors, X and Y ancestors came probably from Africa, although new discoveries are always changing. This shows the different, the point of origin of those people and how they originated, something called the Circum-Arabian Nomadic Complex. And this is all conventional dating. So anyone who is a young Earth creationist, do not come at me. This is estimated language groups, how they emerged, when they emerged. All of these numbers are totally off from the archaeological data. Linguists are kind of goofy about things like that. But you can see that originally you had these groups move into Africa quite a bit before you had the Semitic languages proper emerge. And all of these people share a very common basic culture that ended up persisting throughout from the Neolithic, like into the Iron Age. There was a continuation with certain aspects of the culture that remained the same. So Muhammad was still doing things that these dudes were doing and that these dudes brought with them wherever they went. And one of the major things that was that you would find in these groups is this these rock areas that they would create. They would create often two piles on either end of a long skinny thing or a circular enclosure. And they were associated with rites. And if they're the same rites as we see at the time of Muhammad, not just in Mecca, but everywhere around there, they would be running back and forth from the two piles or circling the center thing in the rounder enclosures. So we find that the dromedary trade routes are established between about 1200 and 1000 BC. That's the camels that we think of whenever we think of the desert. Before that, the camels were mostly the Bactrian variety. But it was, and they couldn't do really well in the hot deserts. They could only do well in cooler deserts. And so these, the dromedary camel types, the one hump camels, right? They really opened up the trade routes for the first time across the desert and really allowed connection between different groups, spread of languages, settlement, things like that. The language underwent several shifts over time, and this shows kind of how various groups spread from one group to another. There are examples of standing stones that people would worship at that time. And then the first time that we have any kind of civilization whatsoever appear in the Hijaz, around Mecca, we have the Ma'an kingdom show up, and it's actually from Yemen down here. It's from Yemen. It's not actually from the northern portion. And you can see the
so when you say a civilization appear, you mean appear in the region
right
around Mecca?
Yes, before that
not the first civilization in human history.
Correct. So
just
it's
to be clear, because that was ripe for a clip.
Yep,
Mary Harb admits Mecca first civilization.
Yeah, this is the first civilization that ever appeared in that area, and this is not enormously long ago. This is well into the Iron Age, when finally somebody with some sort of recognizable history structure, something, claims this area. It is so remote and so backwards compared to the other areas. But this came not from, so the Arabs are up here, the Amorites, the Nabateans are all related. They're not exactly the same thing. The Nabateans are Arabs, the Amorites are not. They're more closely related to the Hebrews. But they are not the ones to settle in the Hijaz for the first time. The Hijaz is settled from the South Arabians, and the South Arabian language is a different but related language. So there are continuities because they're all doing the rock worship, right? But they actually speak a variety of more distantly related languages. And so that's who established, if Mecca was established in before the Quraysh, right? If anybody before the Quraysh established it, it was established by these southern Yemeni, we would say now, people who had spread up and created an empire up here. And they had actually gotten shoved, at this time, they'd gotten shoved out from their original home, which was even farther south. This just shows you kind of the situation in northern Arabia where you actually have proper Arabs at this time, and how they were all fragmented among different groups. The ones that have colored splotches had more coherent, cohesive boundaries. The ones that are out here and just have names, they're pretty much ruled by whoever happened to be ruling that particular city, was just its own, with its own tribe at that time. And this is a guess, because no one knows for sure that Mecca had any existence whatsoever at this time. This is a guess of what it might have been like. And this shows about 100 BC what the situation was. And when the trade routes were big, the trade routes were not very important at all at the time of Muhammad. Everybody thinks that, Mecca was this rich trade center, if they haven't been paying attention. But it wasn't. It was a backward sort of place that no one paid any attention to whatsoever. Why is that? Because Mecca actually belongs like out here in the mountains, whereas the trade route goes alongside the mountains and to the north. For Mecca to be on a trade route, you'd have to imagine that people would want to climb a mountain for literally no reason whatsoever and then climb back off that mountain again. Like, why would anyone ever just climb a mountain for fun and then climb back down again? It makes no sense. It was never on any trade route. This one, even Taif is not important enough to show up here, although it was actually on the trade route, and it was about a day and a half away from Mecca. So you have various changes that happen then. At some point, probably by 480, the Quraysh managed to capture what proto-Mecca, whatever that area was before things were established, really. And at that time, the area down here, by now, this area had been conquered by Jewish converts, or rather, the ones who had conquered it had converted to Judaism, to be more correct. And they started oppressing the Christians closer to 500, AD 500. In the midst of the Aksum Empire coming over, there were a series of dam failures. The last one was after the Aksum Empire, the Christian Empire, invaded because of the oppression that was happening to the Christians by the Jews, the Jewish converts.
That was from Ethiopia, right?
Yes. It's Ethiopia. You can also call it more properly Abyssinia. So it's like a particular kingdom there. And that kingdom has its origins in Yemen. So it's always been closely connected, like politically, to Yemen. So settlers from Yemen founded Damat, which was its predecessor, which eventually evolved into Ethiopia, which converted to Christianity. And then when what they considered to be kind of their distant cousins across the ocean were being oppressed, they went over, took over, but the whole thing destabilized the whole region. Like this whole area was destabilized, which allowed, if you see over on the right, that shows before this started, the this is the not Ganessids, the ones that belong to the Sassanid Empire, their clients.
Lakhmids.
Thank you, Lakhmids. This shows the range of the Lakhmids, who were Arab nationality, who were loyal federati to the Sassanians, right? So they had already reached Oman at this time, And with all the brouhaha, and there was a big mess in Rome with a succession crisis. The Sicilians managed to leapfrog and just take over huge amounts. They took over even Egypt, and they managed to take back this area of Yemen. And you can kind of see the religious situation at this time. So you had the Zoroastrian Persian Empire, and the Lakhmids were not completely Christian, but they had a very substantial proportion of their population were Nestorian. The Genesids, they were Chalcedonian officially, but they had not like driven out all the pagans. There were still a certain proportion of their people there were still pagan. Medina, there was another Jewish city farther to the north too. So you have this picture where almost everyone is Zoroastrian, Jewish, or Christian around here, and the pagans were kind of getting squeezed more and more and more because people were converting very rapidly to one of these, especially two major religions. There's kind of an ethnic component to Zoroastrianism that doesn't transfer well, but particularly Christianity, Judaism, or Manichaeanism, which kind of combines bits and pieces from the bottom of everybody's drawer and invents a new religion. So
yeah, Dr. Gabriel Reynolds talks about the fact that Christian teaching and Christian influence to varying different degrees had sort of perforated around the Arabian Peninsula, as had sort of Jewish influences as well, and that these actually served as a bit of a backdrop to things that then appear in the Quran.
Absolutely. And Muhammad's own slaves. So he had Ayman, right? Ayman, Baraka. He had Zaid. So she was Ethiopian. She was captured as a child. Mm-hmm. And Muhammad spoke the Ethiopic language, Ge'ez, because of her. And so she remembered enough of her childhood that she had some sort of child's idea of what her faith of origin was. Zaid, also, he was captured young. Although he was only 10 years younger than Muhammad, people often think that he was much younger, but he was only 10 years younger than Muhammad. And he was also captured as a young boy from a group that had converted to Christianity. So his tribe was one of those federati that were mostly Christian, but still had a number of people who hadn't converted yet and were pagan, because they were only 2 generations out. Their grandparents were all pagan. So they were only 2 generations out when he was born from paganism. So there were still a number of pagans there, but they had converted to Christianity too. He had a slave called Salma and a slave called Abu Rafi I believe it's Abu Rafi, in Mecca, who were both Christian as well, or the man was Christian as well. He was from, I forget where he was from, but he was from a Christian background, had been captured as well. I'm not sure about his wife. So Muhammad is just surrounded by all these people who, at least as children, had some kind of Christian education and upbringing, and some kind of, very often the ideal age for capturing slaves was 8 to at most 15, more like 14, kind of in that age is the prime get them young, capture a slave age. And so imagine what an 8-year-old would know if they grew up just as kind of a common peasant person in a Christian environment. And that would be what a lot of the people there knew. And at the same time, and it will be up in a second, just all of this. So Mecca was a center for paganism, but it was a center for paganism in a world that was becoming increasingly less and less pagan. So what are they going to do? What's the solution here? It's really kind of what they were facing at that time. So there's some debate about whether or not a place called Makaraba was actually Mecca, and it's possible but not convincing, which I'm skipping all over. So Mecca went from the Yemeni from being controlled by the Minians or Ma'an, however they get, the same empire gets different names, right? And it was under the control, the first time it enters Islamic history, it's under the control of the Jurham tribe, which is a Yemeni tribe. Now, this is very interesting because Muslims want to say it's super, super ancient, but then at the same time, they say that the Jurham tribe controlled it since basically the time of Ishmael forward kind of thing. And I'm like, they have not been there that long. They just really have not been there very long at all in actual history. But, it's part of their fictional history weaving, right? An Arab tribe asked for help against the Yemeni tribe in that area. And a particular Yemeni tribe, which now come to us as Khuza'ah, they responded, they took control, and then later it passed on to the hands of the Quraysh. Now, we should be really suspicious of the name Khuza'ah and also Quraysh, because Khuza'ah actually means scattered, and Quraysh means gathered. That does not sound like patrilineal tribes to me. They sound like confederations that were glued together with treaties and so on. And there's some really good research done by, oh goodness, guy, last name is Robinson. And I think, and he has done he really good research demonstrating that most likely there were a lot of adoptions and fictionalization in the Quraysh early genealogies. So there were only 2 wells very early on, which should immediately make you suspicious about how large this place was, even according to the Islamic narrative. And immediately after the Quraysh take over, they start digging all of these wells in the next generation, which should hint to you that this is the first time there have been very many people there at all, because no one wants to live more than a short distance away from a well. You have to haul lots of gallons and gallons of water every day. There's only so far that you want to go. And so if you don't have water, you don't live there. So if there were only 2 wells, that means that the settlement was very, very small. And even later on, there's, again, Robinson's studies suggest that there were only 500 people in all of Mecca. I think the number was closer to 1,300, because I think that he discounts the much higher number of the folks who weren't Quraysh, who were considered too unimportant to really make a lot of the histories. But still, there were not a huge number of people in this area. It was a very small settlement even then. So Hubal was one of several idols around the Kaaba. And according to the Book of Idols, the first one to set it up was this dude from the Khuza'ah. And then another source actually blames the early Quraysh, whatever, because they're pretending that, it was all the pure monotheism before then, right? But in actuality, and this is another quote that shows another kind of fictionalized history. We do know that Hubal was, in fact, called Allah. If you just read Ibn Ishaq, you have people standing in front of the idol of Hubal and saying, "Oh Allah, to Hubal." So, but that it's kind of interesting, because in a pagan view, that doesn't mean that's transitive. So Hubal is Allah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Allah is Hubal.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I can very well see Muslims in the very near future just dropping Ibn Ishaq altogether. He's proving to be such an embarrassment now in so many different ways that I think possibly within our lifetime we might even see them just say, "Oh no, he's Ibn Ishaq, completely unreliable. We don't use him." Like so many of their hadiths gets reorganized according to their reliability.
I have run into that already. Like, Ibn Ishaq, we don't use him at all. We don't use him. I'm like, well, guess what? If you are saying that your later sources are better than your earlier sources, you're just relying on fabrications, because the later sources can never be more reliable than earlier things. It's just a basic fact.
And Ibn Ishaq is one of the earliest sources.
Right. And so there are times whenever there is one instance where you see someone protesting and basically saying Hubal is better than Allah, but that isn't necessarily saying that Hubal is totally different from Allah, but rather our Hubal, who is Allah, who has this particular idol, is our God. So you before Hubal, what's really interesting is before Hubal, the god would have been Wad, and because that was the main god of the Minions, the kingdom of Ma'an, right? And he was a god of the moon. So if that was an ancient site, if it had been founded then, this would be originally a site where the main moon god was worshipped. And then Hubal got brought in too and also equated. And so Allah is like a title. It was a pagan title from the north and may have been what people first started, the Arabs, when they came to this area I'll just call them, so we don't confuse Arab and South Arabian, the Yemeni people, right? They came to an area with the Yemeni people and wanted to call their god by a name that was in their own proper language, would not have wanted Wad, which was a Yemeni title, and might have chosen Allah for him. And then later went, oh, look, here's a northern god we can put here. He's also Allah, because this is something that pagans just did. They weren't really precise on the boundaries between gods. They would split them, they would join them, they would all be a big mush. But the Quraysh absolutely had the goal of making this like the number one pagan shrine in the world. That was kind of their goal. Everybody in the world is going to come to us, but they're trying to do this at the same time that paganism is on the downswing. So they're trying to create something kind of against the tide. And they do get a lot of local power right there, but a lot of that's because of the Sassanians trying to keep up an outpost of empire so far away from their main power source and being so distant from Rome. And that's really, they were in a power vacuum, and that's really why they could take some advantages. So the first division is supposed to be between the Quraysh of the Hollow and the Quraysh of the outskirts, and the Quraysh of the Hollow are supposed to be more important than the Quraysh of the outskirts. And so we're supposed to believe that the Hashemites, Muhammad's clan, are from the Hollow, except whenever you look at the map, they were not in the Hollow. They were on the outskirts. So again, this is more like where reality and fiction weaving kind of conflict, because you have a memory that there's this division, but then you look at the actual map of where people were and you're like, hang on, they're not where they're supposed to be. So there were two factions very early on because of political divisions internally. Should inherit basically which one of these little clans should be the dominant clan. And the allies of Abd al-Dar, who was like the oldest son of Qusay, they were called the Confederates. The Abd Manaf was not the oldest son, but he was more popular, and they called themselves the Perfumed Ones. And Qusay, according to official documents, his sons and grandsons had a huge number of children. However, there is suspicion that there's quite a bit of adoption as well as new wealth featuring into that. And again, according to 550 is one population that was derived just from the number of children who survived to adulthood in the records, because there are a lot of these nasab productions, which are genealogical productions that were later published, several hundred years later. But the Arabs were like really devoted to genealogy, so they're probably fairly reliable. So this just kind of shows the state and all of these alliances that are here. All of these people are at least officially related to each other, right? And yet they are in opposition to each other about who should control what, who goes with whom. And you can see the different areas they would settle in the clan groups within that. Now, this is way too many houses, by the way. This is just a ridiculous fictionalization that has way too many houses. There weren't this many people. But this kind of shows where the different areas were. And this is rotated. North is actually to your right. And these shows the various wells and how many were actually dug in that second generation. So how small it must have been before then. It may not have even really been a permanent settlement to speak of. Also found some very interesting information that ancient sources agree that square houses were fairly new at the time of Muhammad. One source even puts it to after the time of Muhammad. That's unlikely. But like, these folks were building round huts and enclosures like a lot of people who are they're not settled people. They're very primitive. They don't have the technological know-how to make corners so that your house doesn't fall down. And then it took them quite a while to even build square houses because they're so much not city people. And these people are still pooping out in the fields at the time of Muhammad. Well, not fields, in the wilderness. They go out into the wilderness area to poop because they didn't have a culture of latrines and were like scared of latrine demons. So that's how backwards it was. It wasn't a long time after they came to Medina that anybody started using latrines. Even though all the people in Medina used latrines, the Meccans were still scared of latrines. Like, just put that into your head how primitive these guys were. So Arab political system was built on clientage. If you've heard the term Maula or Wali, terms like that, these relate to whether or not you're a client of one person or another. And the Quraysh were very, very proud of being a free tribe and not being anybody's client. And so there was actually a big push toward, there was this huge push toward getting Mecca to become a client, or the Quraysh to become a client of the Romans by this particular dude who was a cousin of Khadijah, whose name was Uthman ibn Huwayrith. I think that's it. Huwayrith. Yeah. Anyway, he wanted them to become clients because he's like, look, this whole pagan thing, we're between two empires. There's the Ethiopians over there, and they might want to invade us too because we're pagans. And how can we preserve our situation? And he was rejected because they're so proud of being a free tribe. But the problem wasn't resolved. They want to maintain power. They're a pagan shrine. All of these less polytheistic, let's say, because the Zoroastrians aren't properly monotheistic, but less polytheistic systems were around them. And how are they going to survive? Is it eating away with the number of true pagans who would come to their shrine and circle around the stone the way they have since the Neolithic era? People have since the Neolithic area. Not that stone, other stones in the Neolithic area. But this old pattern's falling apart. How can they maintain power in the new structures that are coming? Now, their view of their own supremacy and their own importance is extremely high. So the religion of Islam was really a political system, right? And the political system is truly an Arab supremacist political system. You'll find different ones different ahadith that relay this, and some of them are actually somewhat artificial, like the Arabs are equal to one another and the Malawi are equal to one another. And no, that's not originally former slaves. This is untrue. It's anyone who is not Arab who becomes a Muslim had to become a client. They had to become into the second class. But Muhammad actually taught that the very best people are the Hashemites, who is Muhammad's subclan, right? And then the Quraysh are next, and then the Arabs, and then everyone else below that. And so we see kind of these tensions in here: the Bedouin against a town dweller, the best of the women riding of the camels, and the righteous among the women of the Quraysh. So just who's better, who's worse? Can you marry women, particularly, to lower castes, essentially? So we have all of these different things. Like here's the full rank that Muhammad taught. So the Arabs, then the particular larger clan of Muhammad, then the Quraysh, then the Hashim, and then him at the top. And this was preserved. You still have people call themselves Sayyid, right? Sayyid, that's plural for somebody who is descended from the Hashemite clan. That's still an important position in many of the Arab contexts. So how the Quraysh are always supposed to be the rulers, for instance. So this is really everything that's come into Islam has come out of this context. And so I already talked a bit about the collapse of various political systems and the uproar that happened there, which allowed the Quraysh to close the caravan route that went through Taif. So they took total control of this caravan route at this one spot. That's what they controlled. And they set up a market at Ukaz, farther to the north of where they had closed it off, so that everybody had to trade with them, and then they would trade farther south. And this persisted for a while, and until a variety of wars kind of opened it back up again to a limited degree. But the Quraysh had managed to completely dominate Taif still, and they still were. It seems like they were taking tolls essentially from people who were passing by. They considered all the work except for herding, fighting, and trading beneath them, especially herding camels. They, even herding other animals was kind of lower on their totem pole. They had the values of Bedouins, who were, the fighters out there, but they had the oasis arrogance. Like the settled people thought that they were inherently better than all the Bedouins, and lorded it over Bedouins who did not have an oasis to go to. But they maintained all the Bedouin values of fighting and trading. Something that's interesting about them is that they were known to sell butter, which nobody else would sell. Every other tribe kept all their butter to themselves, and they wouldn't sell it for anything, but they were willing to settle it. They had no agriculture at all whatsoever, though they had managed to, because they had dominated Taif, some people were getting tax, or you can call it taxation, but basically shakedowns of areas in Taif at this time. And so basically Mecca was this backward place. The trade was only local. And these are just some examples of how it was only local. So Hashem became the leader of the perfumed ones. And he had two surviving sons, but it was kind of, the situation was odd because one of his sons was born through matrilocal marriage with a woman in Medina. And so this was probably a form of traveler marriage. She was probably actually married to multiple men at one time. And he was called Abd al-Muttalib, or the slave of Muttalib, because he really had no money to his name. And they try to make it in this kind of joke, but it probably was that he basically had no inheritance. But he eventually became the important one after he received the job of water bearer. He dug an extra well down in the sacred space that was apparently controversial to dig it like right next to the Kaaba instead of hauling it out from neighboring wells. And that saved him a bunch of money. And so he was still collecting the same amount of money, but all he had to do was hire or get a slave to stand there and empty the bucket into the two water troughs. And they didn't have to haul it from other wells anymore, which saved him a ton of money. And this allowed him to broker that into leadership of his own clan. And he was able, after that, to marry a lot of wives. Before then, he only had a slave wife and one son. Muhammad was born from one of his sons. Okay, one of his younger sons, actually. Um, so his grandfather is Abd al-Muttalib, and married a whole bunch of women. Two of them are related to one another. So we have Fatima, that was kind of like his main wife, because the first one is had previously been a slave. The oldest son died anyway, and then he married a woman from a higher class clan who were his most important heirs. And they had, and the most important sons of this are Abu Talib, Abdullah, and Abdullah. And then another important son is Abu Lahab, who comes from Lubna, who was a different wife. Amina was an orphan from the Zura clan of the Quraysh. She was being cared for by an uncle who was the father of Hala, and at the same time, Amina and Hala, they were both married. One to the father. Hala became the very last wife of Abd al-Muttalib, and then Amina became the wife of Abdullah, and she was his only wife. Abdullah did die soon after the wedding, but soon after this double wedding, a guy named Abbas is born. Al-Abbas is born, and he was I have him on the wrong person. Or excuse me. No, it is Hamza. It's Hamza. Excuse me. It is Hamza. Hamza was born, and he was said to be born 4 years before Muhammad. Now remember, Amina marries Abdullah. He dies almost immediately, and her son, supposedly by Abdullah, was born 4 years later. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know that if this actual linear narration is true, that was not actually Abdullah's son. And there are a few reasons to believe that this was so, that she wasn't actually his son. One of the most important reasons is that this is such a significant event that 3 of the Sunni schools have a very long period of potential gestation of 4 or more years. Like they say that you can have a baby 4 or more years after you get pregnant. 2 of them say 4, one of them says 5, right? And the basis for that is really that Muhammad was born that much later. They believe that firmly. So to them, this is absolute fact. Another reason in the sources to suspect this was true was that Muhammad was brought in front of Hubal after he was born. Now, Hubal was a divining deity. So if you have a question, you go, "Hey, Hubal, is so-and-so my son or my grandson?" And then the soothsayer takes some divining arrows and throws them on the ground and reads them magically and tells you why, yes, he is your son, or why, no, he is not your son or grandson or whatever. There are also some very odd things in that it says in the sources essentially that Amina never breastfed her own son. Thuwayba was supposed to be his first nurse, who came to him immediately upon his birth and immediately breastfed him. And then he was sent out to the countryside. And I cannot find a single other person who was nursed out into the countryside. I find assurances that it was a tradition at that time, but I can't find anyone of the Quraysh who had a Bedouin wet nurse who took him out to the countryside. No one. Only Muhammad. And so these irregularities in his birth suggest that it really is true that he was born 4 years later after his father died. So Muhammad being born from a woman whose his fatherhood was questioned quite a bit, and he was an orphan, and also the fact that he had no money, because Abdullah should have had some money. So when he died, if he'd had a son, his son should have inherited, but his son doesn't inherit. Why? Because his patrimony was already distributed long before his son was born. So it was, all the inheritance was given out a long time ago. So all of that is very suggestive that, and it also plays into the very low status that Muhammad had in his own family. Hamza later called him the slave of my father when he was drunk. Even though Hamza really liked Muhammad, they got along well, but he still called him the slave of my father. So there's strong evidence that Muhammad was a bastard because of being fostered in the desert and everything else. He was returned after he was weaned. According to the narrative, at 6 years old, his mother took him to Yathrib, which is Medina later, and she dies on the way back. It makes no sense that she took him to Yathrib. The only relations that she had in Yathrib were her stepmother's brothers, might have been in Yathrib. But we're told that they're taking the boy to visit his uncles. He doesn't have any uncles there. Why is she there? I don't know why she's actually there. But anyway, according to, can you think of any reason that she'd be there, Bob? Because her stepmother's brothers are not a relation of her, because this is a polygamous society, right? And so it's just another wife of his, of her father.
Apart from friendship, maybe.
But who would she be friends with? That's the question. So I think that maybe she was trying to set up the same kind of local traveler marriage arrangements, which would have been a lot easier in a caravan town. But I can't really think of a valid reason that she'd go out there. But she dies on the way back to Mecca, and the only thing that Muhammad apparently inherits is this woman called Barakah, which means blessing, right? And she was probably 8 to 10 years older than him, given that she was supposed to be given to Amina when they married. Remember, 4 years later, he's born. So she has to be at least 8 years, probably quite a bit, probably 10, close to 12, somewhere in there, older than he is. And this slave was actually as much of a mother figure to him as anyone, and the reason why he spoke Ge'ez, Ethiopic, right? So he was then taken, and so now he's completely an orphan. He's taken in by his grandfather until he was 8. His grandfather dies. And this is why Hamza calls him my father's slave, because Hamza is his uncle born from Hala. And so that's Muhammad's grandfather, Hamza's father. He was taken in by Abu Talib and raised. But there's something very sinister about this, because Abu Talib has a very clear sexual preference in the sources for handsome boys. A very clear preference. He was also taken by his older uncle Azubair and by Abu Talib on caravan trips. And that's also very suspicious, because he was supposed to be only 12 at the time. And you did not take this, like Bedouins would, in some places at some times across the entirety of the nomadic desert culture, right? And some of those women did travel on these, and families did travel on in some caravans for some trading. But in this context, in the Arab culture here and in other areas out in Arabia at this time, women did not travel, and also children did not travel. You had adult fighting age men travel because it was dangerous, and you only wanted people who fought. You didn't even have like boys to water the camels. If boys traveled, they were caravan wives, which I don't think I need to explain what caravan wives were for. So this is also very suggestive of kind of what the kind of trauma that Muhammad went to. And here is a hadith from Al-Razi, right? Abu Talib said one day to his brother Al-Abbas, "Shall I not tell you about Muhammad and what I saw from him?" He said, "Yes." So he said, "I took him to me, so how can I not leave him for an hour of the night or day, and I do not trust anyone with him? Even I used to make him sleep in my bed, so I ordered him one night to take off his clothes and sleep with me, and I saw the dislike on his face, but he hated to contradict me. He said, "Oh, uncle, turn your face away from me until I take off my clothes because no one should look at my body." To look at his body, I did not see anything, and I also missed him from my bed. So if I got up to see him, he called me, "Here I am, uncle, so come back." So it was not usual for people to sleep without clothing in this culture either. People did not just sleep naked. Why? Because a lot of times people slept in large groups. Families slept together, even husband and wife often, when they were having intercourse, did not actually get naked because a lot of times there were kids in the room, just like a few feet away. So you tended to be a bit quieter and more discreet and not as nakedy, right? It's just not a naked culture. And yet you have this where he's calling him, "Oh, take off your clothes." And there's a different version of this particular hadith that I couldn't find this time that talked about how he was, one time he called him to his bed and he got in the bed and he was surprised because he still had clothes on. I'm like, yeah, he would have clothes on, wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? So it's very interesting. We also find out later that when Abu Talib is being told, "Hey, just stop supporting your nephew. Just stop supporting him. He's causing problems. We will give you anything if you stop supporting him." And guess what the anything they offered was? Take a wild guess, Bob, as to the thing that they thought he would love the most.
Children.
A very handsome youth, the handsomest youth of the entire city. We will give him to you. And that's
and it's well established, isn't it, that there's a strong connection between people that are abused as children who go on to abuse children.
Oh yeah. And yeah, there are a lot of very, very disquieting things in the sources. And I mean, just the fact they try to say, "Oh, so he could be your son in Btbsoco." No, he had 4 sons. He did not need another son. And he certainly did not need the handsomest youth of the Quraysh to be his son. The handsomest youth of the Quraysh would be used for something quite different.
I'm quite sure.
So then there were the sacrilegious wars. And this was the most traumatic event of Muhammad's youth. And it happened so they had shut off just south of Medina here, right? They had established this Ukaz fair and wouldn't let anybody trade across this distance here, all the way down to nearly Najran, right? They took this hunk, and these people out here, the Lakhmids, they are still desert people. They do not like trading overseas. Almost all of the trade to Rome was now going the sea route. So the spice road, it was all sea-based. The stuff from Africa, it was all sea-based. But these guys over here, these Lakhmids, they are not sea people. They are very much land people. And so they were still trading overland and wanted to get down here and trade this direction to get down to Yemen, because Yemen was wealthy. All these people in the middle didn't really matter, but Yemen had money. They wanted to trade with Yemen. And the Quraysh were keeping them from doing that. So there was this really elaborate reason for a war that was about who got picked for a caravan and someone taking revenge and this and that and the other. But the real reason was about shutting off this land. It was called the Sacrilegious War because it occurred, oh heavens, during the sacred pagan months when no one is ever supposed to fight. And this is the most traumatic event in Muhammad's lifetime and the biggest offense against their pagan culture, that this fighting, these wars happened in the holy month, right? So this is a big deal. What you don't do, you do not fight in the holy month. No one fights in the holy month. These people are terrible outlaws, awful people, just terrible, terrible, terrible because they're fighting in the holy month. When was the Battle of Badr? Do you remember?
Was that in Ramadan by any chance?
Yeah, it was during the holy month. I just want to point that out for everybody. That Muhammad immediately did the thing that was supposed to be the worst, most horrific thing that anyone could possibly do. Yeah, Muhammad did it as soon as he had a chance.
Well, I mean, Muslims have been fighting in every Ramadan since the founding of Islam, haven't they?
Yep.
I don't think there's been a Ramadan that's passed where they haven't been fighting in Ramadan.
So after this big
including
nasty,
at the corner.
yeah, yep. After this big nasty fight, a whole bunch of Quraysh were actually killed during it. A lot of the people who were said to be killed during it weren't, because they were kept having kids afterwards, if you keep reading the sources, but the early sources are a huge mess anyway. The Quraysh overall won, but it was not they knew that this was not a victory that they could hold on to. They couldn't keep everything closed. You will find that by the time Muhammad gets to Medina, there is no importance of the Ukaz market. It doesn't exist as an important market anymore. That's because they had reopened the trade route because of pressure from both the Sassanids and the Romans. They were like, we can't keep doing this, but we want to have this kind of power. A big blood feud was prevented whenever some of the Confederates cheated a Yemeni who had an alliance with the Quraysh. The Yemeni appealed to the Quraysh, and the Quraysh said, nope, you're not one of us. And then the Yemeni embarrassed the Quraysh by reciting this big poem accusing them. But one of the leaders of I spelled that wrong, Hashemites, not Hishamites. Hashemites formed the League of Virtue with most of the other perfumed ones, and they agreed to personally cover the Yemeni's losses. They're cast in the history of nobly preventing another sacrilegious war, and they're upholding the rule of law over tribal alliances. That's the big point of League of Virtue. League of Virtue said, well, we should stop behaving like these bandit robbers if we want to have success long term. The short-term bandit robber thing is not really going to get us where we want to go. We need to do something else. And then under the pressure of the League of Virtue, the monopoly on that trade route was revoked. I believe after this point, they're like taking payments from all the caravans that are coming from Rome or coming up south, but they no longer had it completely closed off, which they're thinking strategically long term that they can't continue to act like a band of robbers or somebody who's going to come and bring an army and kill the nest of robbers, right? So now we have three different groups who are kind of at odds with one another. The League of Virtue is the one who's tied to the Kaaba most closely. They want to keep everybody coming to their big, whenever everybody goes to all the different pagan shrines, they want theirs to be the biggest, best shrine. They don't want people avoiding their shrine because they're all robbers. And since so much of their trade depended on people coming to the shrine during those months and trading there, then they really, this really was in their long-term interest. But again, this pagan world is beginning to crash. What are they going to do? So that is not... So this political landscape actually lasted way past the advent of Islam. And you still had these different groups who the League of Virtue and the perfumed ones and the Confederates who are opposed to one another in the sources long after Muhammad. This is still underlying later politics, and you still see it continuously coming through as these different groups in Mecca push against each other. I'm not really sure who Al-Harith belongs to because they're not actually important, but the rest of them, it was clear which side they fell on was quite clear. And so, again, these lines are being drawn differently. Now, there were this is only a few of the monotheist Arabs. There are actually a ton more that I have not even added yet. But Muhammad is usually conceptualized as like this lone guy who goes and gets all this insight or whatever. No, he was running around with tons of, aside from all the slaves who had come from monotheist background. This is aside from them, right? There's also, what's his name? Abu Dhar as well, who should be in here, and some other people. And among and a lot of the people they don't like to list because it's too revealing. So you'll have like the 4 Hanifs of Ibn Ishaq, and you'll think, oh, these are the 4 Arabs in the area who are monotheists. No, there were tons more. For example, Abu Bakr was certainly a monotheist, and he even named his oldest child Abd al-Rahman, right? Abu Rahman, depending on how you've run it together, right? And Rahman is a South Yemeni title for God the Father used by the Christians that was then applied to God when people converted to Judaism. So this is not at this time, this is not any kind of polytheistic title, polytheistic context, anything. It is a Christian or Jewish specific title. And they used this title for our buddy here. He used this title for his own son, even though his oldest son, which is really funny, was actually a pagan. It's also significant that you have that the other people are called Abd al-Rahman. They were all renamed who are older, who were not born with that name. They were renamed by Muhammad. This is the one guy who had that name from birth, and he had that name from Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr was a monotheist. Even though his son grew up to be a polytheist, he was a monotheist. And this was Uthman ibn al-Huwayrith, who was closely related to Khadijah. And so this was before I had dealt in there the fanciful and muddy tales. I figured out after reading all the sources on him that his entire thing was that he wanted them to convert to Christianity officially so that they could become federati of Rome and then have an ally with Rome and then have a position in the future with this collapsing pagan world. But then what happens to their place of pilgrimage? How could they maintain wealth and power? They're doing this to get power, but on the other hand, their pagan shrines going away. Like, how is this able to be? How can you square this circle is really what they're trying to do here. And Muhammad is the one who ends up doing it. So there are a whole bunch of different people who are identified as prophets in the Islamic literature during Muhammad's lifetime. And one of the most important ones is Umayyah ibn Salt, who was in Taif, because he called his god Allah. And that is the only monotheistic reference to an Allah that we really have in the context of Arabia at this time. The other, like all the Northern Arabian inscriptions, are clearly polytheistic that mention Allah. So Muhammad famously marries Khadijah. So now we're finally at the first wife of Muhammad. He famously marries Khadijah. She was married to 2 other men. And there is something of a disagreement on whether or not she was divorced or widowed. I think she actually was widowed. I believe that this ties into an ancient Semitic prejudice against twice widowed women, that they are what's called killer wives. And you'll actually find this prejudice back in Genesis with Tamar and Judah. So Judah married Tamar to his first son. That son died, then married her to Onan, and Onan died. And so he was afraid to marry her to his third son because he thought that she was like a killer wife. Well, this is something that Arabs still, to this day, you will find Arabs who believe that a woman who's had 2 dead husbands, she's got some sort of something that happens from her, however unintentionally, and kills her husband, so she should never marry a third. So the fact that Khadijah married so far beneath her for the third can be easily explained by the fact not that, she was turning away all her suitors, or even that she wanted to control her future independence, but just the fact that there was this killer wife superstition and she had 2 dead husbands. That also explains why there are a few minority accounts that says, no, they didn't both die. She got divorced, but they don't have any other kids, and we never hear from them again, but she totally got divorced. So that kind of explains that. So she probably, and Hind, her daughter Hind may have had 1 child, according to some. So no issue / marriage may not be correct. It really is unclear. But her first son was most likely named Ab-Manaf. Not that Manaf is a pagan deity. This is not a monotheistic name. She had 2 more sons, and then eventually she marries Muhammad. So there are a lot of uncertainties and contradictions in the sources concerning her. There's several papers about all the sons that different people attribute to her and children and everything else. But this is my best shot at reconciling everything. So according to sources, she asked for a caravan lead to lead her camels. Muhammad was put forward by Abu Talib as being a good choice. He had asked to marry Abu Talib's daughter, Fahita, later Hani, and he was refused because he was too poor. But about 5 years later, Khadijah married Muhammad. He's 25. She proposed the marriage through her slave and tricks her father into endorsing the marriage by getting him really drunk. And actually, the Ibn Ishaq says 20 camels, but I suspect that that's not true. I suspect it actually was 5 camels because I see absolutely no way that he could raise 20 camels. And I found another source that said 5 camels, and I can't find it now. But anyway, if you run through, you can find out that the 5 camels are quite a bit worth quite a bit less than one reasonably valuable male slave, a slave in the prime of his life, right? So, and that's important because whenever Khadijah marries Muhammad, she gifts him with a slave. It is not normal for the wife to give the husband anything at marriage. And I believe that this was done to maintain her independence, because I believe that she gifted him something that was in excess of what he gave her in monetary value. And there were several forms of pre-Islamic marriage that were abolished by Islam. And one of them was a form of marriage that was matrilocal, where the man would move into the woman's house. And we all know that Muhammad moved into Khadijah's house. Otherwise, he should be required to build her a house, right? But he moved into her house. And in that case, she maintains certain authority. She maintains the authority to divorce him. So it is her choice whether or not to divorce him. It's probably also her choice whether or not to take another husband. But I, would see why a woman would typically want to do that, to take an additional husband and not divorce one and replace him. But I believe that probably she could technically do that, but she wasn't in a kind of traveler marriage arrangement, unlike his great grandmother. So she had no desire to do that. But this is really, the fact that she gave him a slave is really the answer as to why he only had one wife at that time. And also why it was clear that it was Khadijah's money rather than, because whenever in the early Islamic time, whenever men married women, they controlled their assets so completely that it really didn't really matter whether or not it was the wife's money. The man could spend whatever. It's just if he divorced her, he had to cough up the money that was due her one way or another. But until the divorce, it was his to do with what he wanted. But it's very clear in the sources that this is still treated as Khadijah's money in a very distinct way. So I believe that this form was a matrilocal marriage, and it was not out of desperate love for Khadijah, but rather because he could not marry anyone else that he didn't. So this is a specific reference to the killer's wife prejudice or belief. And you find that this was happening in, here's a report from the Arab village of Artes, south of Bethlehem, and this is like in the 20th century. 1935, right? That they still believed in this killer wife phenomenon. So, Khadijah has 4 daughters and 1 or 2 sons with Muhammad. Some sources say up to 4. I don't think that that's realistic. I think it was 2. I think it was probably true based on all the sources and all the ahadith. The larger numbers don't make sense. Last daughter, Fatima, the 4th daughter, she was born in 605. And in 605, the Kaaba is destroyed by flood and rebuilt with a roof for the first time. Now, I want you to think about this. This is their most important building that they have in the entire place. And it was at the ground level. It was not raised up. So it was susceptible to floods. It had a wall that was a bit taller than a man, and it had a door in it, but it was completely open at the top. That is actually why, you know how it has like curtains now all the time?
Mm.
Well, most Muslims seem to have forgotten that it didn't have a roof on it before, and that's why it has curtains, because it had a tent roof for years and years. It had a tent roof, and the tent roof would drape over the sides. And when they put an actual roof on it finally after the storm, they went ahead and continued covering it because that's what they always had done, and that like looked more proper to them, and that was their tradition. But they didn't need a reason for someone put covers on it. No, it had no roof. So it needed a tent roof. And the reason it didn't have a roof is because they were incapable technologically of covering a building as large as a Kaaba with a roof. They didn't have any trees nearby that were large enough, and they lacked the sophistication to bring in trees from other places until there was a big wreck at Jeddah during the storm. There's a huge wreck, and they took the largest timbers from the ship and used that to create the beams across to shorten the distance so that their little poles and mats and mud and stuff could form a roof. But at the same time that Mecca did not have a roof, this was centuries after the Hagia Sophia had been created, right?
Mm.
Like all the temples, all the churches, all the glorious Roman everything. These people could not put a roof on a building that was like 40 feet wide. They technologically could not do it. So just keep that in mind about what kind of place this is. You know, you look how unimposing the Kaaba is now. This is a rebuilt Kaaba that is much more, you know, it's been rebuilt many times to be much more impressive. It's the same size, you know, length and width as before. That's much taller, much taller and more impressive than it ever was before. And it was for the first time raised up above ground level to prevent as much water sweeping through, and also because people used to break into it and steal the offerings out of it. People would leave, I guess, valuable things in it. People would steal the offerings, so they raised up the opening, and it used to have two doors, and they closed one up, and they only put in one door, and they put in like mobile wooden steps that they could take away at night so people wouldn't break in and steal all their stuff. That's how primitive this place is. Also, the back, the curved part at back, that was originally part of the structure, and they couldn't figure out how to put a roof on something that was round like that. They just like couldn't figure out how to do it. So they gave up and left that part open and closed in the rest. And I think it's also that they used to take animals inside and sacrifice them. And once you put up steps and you raise up the thing, getting animals inside and sacrificing them would just be so much more difficult. I think that they left that part as well because it was simpler to leave out, but also because now you still have a place to sacrifice the animals in. And without wooden steps that you have to try and get these animals, and a door that you have to like get them to try to fit through. So I think they closed up the larger door that the animals had previously gone through, and then left that half moon shape at the back to have a place to get the animals in to sacrifice them still. So Abu Talib had inherited the role of provisioner and water bearer, but drought came and he got broke. So one of the things you had to do as water bearer and provisioner is that I think you had to provide food and water and food. I think you had they would collect money from the people who came in and visited. And then with that money, you needed to provide the food and the water for them the next year. And if you have a drought and all the prices spike up, then all of a sudden you're no longer making lots of money, but you're spending from your own wealth, and suddenly you have nothing left and you're broke. And I think that's what happened to Abu Talib. And that's the reason that his sons, Jafar, went to live with Abbas, and Ali came to live with Muhammad, and they took them in to take the expense of raising them off of Abu Talib. So Talib, the heir, and then his favorite son stayed with him, and then the other two went with other uncles and were brought into their households and supported by them from then on. And that also made Abu Talib have a debt to Muhammad now because he's taken in his son. So we have our famous encounter in the cave of Hira, right? And again, this is in the context of what are we going to do about all of this stuff, but there's also context for Muhammad as well. So I said that he probably had 2 sons. Well, at this point, according to the Ahadith, he had had one son that died while still nursing. And so he only had daughters, so he had no heir. And that meant that because he had no heir, like that, men were considered to be cut off, that they had no progeny, they had no future, they had nothing else. And there was also an idea that if you had, sorry guys, if you had premature ejaculation, you would have daughters, but if you had more self-control, you would have sons. That was a belief that was common in that time. You can find it in the Talmud. It's related to things that Aristotle said and things like that. So at the same time that he didn't have any sons, people around could have been making fun of him, saying, hey, look, the reason that you don't have any sons is that you're not good in bed, basically. And when Surah 96 is supposed to be the first one, I don't think it's the first, but I think it's one of the first, okay? And I have complicated reasons for that, but I don't think it's the first. But you'll find in it that you hear that it is the God of writing who is giving him this revelation, the one who teaches men by the pen. This ties very strongly into Hermetic traditions and into pagan thought in general, that you have gods of different domains. And so the God of writing reveals this to him. And what does it reveal to him? That he's not bad in bed, that men were made from a blood clot, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that, it was Galen who was it Galen? No, yeah, it was actually Aristotle who said that it was premature ejaculation that.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking about something else.
Yeah, no. But anyway, it was like a reassurance that no, you aren't bad in bed. It was the decision of your Lord, because this God is not called Allah at this point. He's called Al-Rab. That's his first name in the sources. That Al-Rab has chosen to create the children out of blood clots, however he wishes to create them. And no, Muhammad, you are not bad in bed. Do not be so worried about the fact that you don't have a child coming. And at this point, Khadijah was probably finally older than 40. She was not 40 years old when they married, because no one went around running going, oh, you have a miraculous, you're already a miracle worker because your 40-something-year-old wife keeps popping out babies. Like, people don't have 6 kids after 40 now, much less back then. Back then, women had in pre-modern societies, women have menopause earlier. And so they go through perimenopause earlier. So having a child after 40 was quite a bit less common than it is to do naturally now. Forget medical aid, but even naturally, right? And the idea that anyone could produce 6 kids would be one of millions and millions and millions and millions. So she was not that old. But at this point, she probably was. So he supposedly taught in secret for 3 years. He was probably he was saying, we can deduce from the sources, he was saying that you need to turn away from all your previous gods. You need to follow Rab. And perhaps he may have given his god the name Rahman already at this point. And he told people that he did not worship any of the gods that the Quraysh worshipped. So that entire surah that's like, you don't worship what I worship, I don't worship what you worship, blah, 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 blah. That is in direct contradiction to his other statements that you guys are associators, that you're adding gods to the God that I worship, that you also worship. At this time, he is teaching that I am worshiping a totally separate God than any God that you worship. And he did it, quote, in secret, which really meant probably he was telling everybody, but he was not like loudly denouncing the other gods traditionally for the first 3 years. So at this time also, Muhammad heard from Waraqah that he was the prophet like Moses. And he started using that as his his main idea, and that the messenger comes from the people. He begins to teach that every group has a messenger, and that messenger always comes from within their own group. So he is a messenger to not to the Arabs, to the Quraysh. That's the only people he's a messenger to. So, because remember, there's Abu Ibn Salt over there, or excuse me, Ibn Abu Salt over in Taif, and he is a messenger to Taif, and Muhammad is a messenger to Mecca. So he's just a messenger to Mecca at this point. But he also declares that he's the last prophet, because every other settlement, every town, every village in the entire world has already gotten its own prophet. This is not every large people. This is every settlement, every balad, every little village in the world has now had its own prophet come to it, and he's the last one. And he's only bringing a reminder of everything that's been told before. And the end of the world is about to happen because he's the last prophet. All that needs to happen is that we need to stand here, pray, we need to donate, and stay clean, adopt these ritual cleanliness practices. Pray all night is a huge thing there. And he also affirmed free will at this point. But Allah misses, or Al-Rab at this point, misses Muhammad's deadline, and then he begins to denounce the pagan gods publicly. And this causes a rift. His main opponents are traditionally within his own group, Abu Lahab. But one thing that's important to notice is that Abu Lahab actually protects him enormously. Even though he opposes him and what he's doing, he's also offering active protection of Muhammad. So Abu Lahab is like, I don't agree with you. You need to stop this. You're causing problems. But no one else touched him. No one hurt him. And this goes back and forth. And, both of these things are true. Abu Sufyan, who is married to a daughter of Abu Talib. And then you also have, these are two different Abu Sufyans. It's very confusing. So we have Abu Sufyan, who's just usually called Abu Sufyan. We also have Abu Sufyan, whose name was Sakhr, or I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that very well. Sorry. Then there's Amr ibn Hisham, who's called Abu Jahal. That's what you'll probably hear him as most of the time. And then Al-As, who was a big opponent as well. So these are the main opponents of Muhammad at this time. And he was heavily protected by Abu Talib and also Abbas, but he was also protected by Abu Lahab, even though he's or Abu Lahab, even though he is an opponent. This is also when, so two of Muhammad's daughters, his middle two daughters, were already married through betrothal to Abu Lahab's two sons that we know of. He may have or there's a couple of other sons that we don't really know very much about, and one who may have died. But anyway, his two important sons are married to Muhammad's two prepubescent daughter. Here's the important thing. They were married before Muhammad decided that he was a prophet. And yet Muhammad decides he's a prophet. And yet they're living in Muhammad's house. The betrothal has been signed. It's done. It's a sealed deal. But they're still living in Muhammad's house. Why? Because they are prepubescent. Because this is only a betrothal at this point. And these early marriage ceremonies were or not marriage ceremonies, but these early betrothal, they were very common in the sources. But prepubescent intercourse was not. So after Muhammad decided he was a prophet, before he denounced everyone, he went and Abu Lahab went and grabbed the two girls and was like, I want to get them out of this bad environment, and took them to his house. And what did not happen there is that his two sons, who were both post-pubescent at this point, did not have intercourse with the two prepubescent girls. In fact, after Muhammad suddenly starts denouncing the gods of Quraysh, then the true rift happens between Abu Lahab and Muhammad. He sends back the girls. He sends them back with only a half dowry because they are both still virgins. So they had spent 3 years at his house growing up but his sons had not had intercourse with them, even though the oldest one was like 12 at this time, because they weren't pubescent yet. Muhammad is the first person that I can find who had intercourse with a prepubescent in any of the sources. That is an important point, because everyone goes, oh, this prepubescent sex then, they were all doing it then. I can't find any evidence of that. Please tell me which woman was divorced as a prepubescent and given a dower, a mahar as a result. I can't find one.
And even before this, the Byzantine Empire raised the age at which the consecration of marriage could have occurred. I think it had been raised to 14 in the Byzantine Empire.
Well, it had
by
been
the 7th
12.
century.
Yeah, it had been 12, and that was
Yeah,
the oldest Roman
so
law.
even
But it was
even
12 and
centuries
pubescent.
before Islam, it was older than 9.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm saying that even in Muhammad's backwards pagan context, the pagans were behaving better than he did. Abu Lahab, who is supposed to be like the worst of the worst, he's gotten an entire surah devoted to how awful he is. Right? He is terrible. He's the worst baddie possible. His sons did not have intercourse with Muhammad's underage daughters because it wasn't appropriate. So, like if this is the worst guy that you can come up with, and yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, even in the context of pagan Arabia, what they're claiming happened did not happen. So, here are some of the. Well, I've forgotten one of two of the slaves of Muhammad, because I found them in a Shia source after this, and then I confirmed them in Sunni sources too. They do a very poor job of documenting all of Muhammad's slaves when they came into the family. But Muhammad brought a slave into the family, Barakah, whom I already talked about. She was a slave that had been given to his mother on marriage with the father, and was his only possession at that time. She had a son, Ayman, and was called Ayman. She was from Ethiopia, and Muhammad spoke Ethiopic because of her. We already covered that. Khadijah had received Zayd as a wedding present. Had not received him as a wedding present, had received them before then. She gave him as a wedding present. She gave him to Muhammad as a wedding present, but she'd had him for quite some time. And Zayd, I hadn't fixed that. Sorry about that. And that was probably why she had authority over herself after their marriage, because of that gift. She previously also had a male slave, Maysara, and then there's also Abu Rafi and his wife Salma, whom I don't have here. He may have had an enslaved wife, he may not have. It's really unclear. In some sources, he's very old, and others very young. This seems to be to make Khadijah look more as innocent as possible, right? Because she has this male slave, so you want to make him very old or very young, so he couldn't possibly be any kind of threat to her chastity, and also potentially because he wouldn't then be suitable for leading a caravan. But I don't think slaves were allowed to be in charge of caravans of any sort, like not even as a secondary person. I think you had to be a free person to do that in this culture. So there was a son. We're not sure when he's born. He died while nursing. Zainab is the oldest daughter who's recorded. She was married to Abu al-As, who was the son of Khadijah's sister, and marriage was contracted at Khadijah's request at some time before 610. She would end up having 2 living children, and they did not divorce. When Muhammad started spouting all this stuff out, she was probably, at least 15 at this time. So she was old enough that the marriage got consummated probably right before he'd announced everybody, and her husband was like, I don't want to get rid of her, thanks, and didn't divorce her. Ruqayya is the next, and she again was contracted to Utbah, who was a son of Abu Lahab, And then later on, she was married to Uthman, who would be Caliph Uthman. Shortly after, by 615. So Muhammad comes out, he rails against the people, and then shortly after, he marries her to one of his converts and sends them both over to Abyssinia to be safer. So, but she dies young. Kulthum, she's contracted to Utayba, who's the second son, in some sources first son, so very confused, of Abu Lahab. Before then, divorced again, somewhere between age 9 and 11. She was married to Umar after her sister died. Before then, she was kept for marriage. That's a very interesting point. Whenever everybody's being married off, he keeps her back for marriage. Fatima also was kept back from marriage. She was not married until she was 19 years old. This is also very interesting because Abu Bakr asked to marry her and was refused because she was too young, as according to Muhammad. At this time, Muhammad was either had already consummated or was just about to consummate his marriage to Aisha, who was half Fatima's age at the time that the marriage was consummated. Fatima was 18, Aisha was 9. Imagine a man who's having intercourse with your 9-year-old telling you that you can't marry his 18-year-old because his 18-year-old is too young.
Yeah, there is a bit of irony there.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
And he marries her to a man closer to her age. Amazing. But also significantly to a man with only one wife. I want you to notice something. None of the husbands of Muhammad's wives were ever allowed to marry a second woman as long as Muhammad was alive, as long as the daughters were alive. So after the daughters died, they could marry as many as they wanted, right? But until their daughters died, they had to be faithful to one. And this is quite remarkable, given how many wives that many of the early Muslims had, because they were, capturing people all the time, and stuff like that. Especially someone as prominent enough to be married to one of his daughters, only one. Now, why is that? Because it would hurt their feelings, because it would offend them, because it is bad for women. Muhammad knows that polygamy is something that is objectively bad for women. However, he allows it and promotes it because the men around him like it. Just want that sink in for everyone. His daughters are too good.
It's interesting. Again, it's kind of like a convenient use of his own authority.
Yep. And
everyone else can have, but these are my daughters. I don't want them to be upset and sad and complaining to me. So you can only have my daughter as a wife.
Yeah, and when Fatima asked to marry, whenever Ali asked to marry another woman, Muhammad stood up and complained, did this big public thing where he was doing a sermon where he was talking about how much better one of his sons-in-law. It's actually the one who was married to Zainab, because that's the only other daughter he had who was still alive at that point. But how much better that son was, because that his son-in-law was, because that son-in-law has never asked to marry anyone else and has never offended him or his daughter in such a way. So again, what's good for the goose ain't good for the gander, and Muhammad's
yeah.
So other children of Muhammad and Khadijah, there's one confirmed son, Al-Qaisim, or Qaisim, right? Or Qaisim. I think it's Qaisim. His real name was actually probably Abd al-Uzza. Al-Qaisim is probably his post-Islamic nickname because his actual name was too embarrassing. Al-Uzza is another pagan god. He died before Islam while suckling, and another nickname that was probably applied to him is Tahir, or I'm not sure whether or not that's a long I or not. There is most likely a second son born to Khadijah, who was born after 610. And right around 610, if you take Khadijah being 28, as she was according to some sources, whenever Muhammad married her, then she would have been just she would have been 43 at the time of Muhammad's revelation, which is very close to getting to where it's very unusual back then to get pregnant and have a child. Very unusual, but not unheard of. You're getting close to unheard of, but not in that realm yet. So at the time that he had his revelation, she could have conceived one more time and she could have been pregnant then. And that could have been part of what led him to his crisis, that she was pregnant. You know, what's going to happen? Am I finally going to get my son, et cetera, and has his demon paralysis, demon cave moment, partly as a result of all of the stress that he's under, because there is a tradition that he did have one son who died in infancy after he had his revelation. But that's particularly embarrassing for Muslims because it's the idea that Allah doesn't love him and lets his sons die kind of thing kind of creeps in. But there is a particular Quranic verse about, no, you are the one who is cut off. And in the context of that verse, in some tafsir, it says that was given after one of Muhammad's sons died, and that could only be a son, you know, in infancy or very young. That could only be a son who is born right after Islam. So he's usually given as Abdullah if he isn't raised entirely. It is possible that he was born like right before he really clarified some things and ironed things out. And so his actual name may have been Abd Manaf, because that's also given in some sources that he had a son named Abd Manaf, which is another pagan name. Another nickname is probably Al-Tayyib, again, probably given because it's nicer for Islam. So this is whenever Al-As ibn Wa'il called Muhammad Al-Abtar, which is the one cut off. And that's actually recorded in the Quran. So he did call him that. And in some sources it says that he was called that right after a son died. Some versions make Al-Tahir, Al-Tayyib, or both extra sons. And there's other possibilities of order, birth order, and things. It's just very, very unclear. But perhaps one of them was born in 610, dies in 612, and thus Surah 108 is revealed with the accusation that you're the cutoff one and Allah doesn't love you because your son died. So there's some really funky stuff going on with the story of Muhammad's black slave, Barakah. So she was older than Muhammad by somewhere between, well, not 12 years minimum, but let's say 8 to 12 years minimum, or in that range probably, right? The traditional narrative says that she was married to Zayd ibn Haritha after he was divorced from Dura bin Abu Lahab. So Zayd apparently had what's called a sister swap marriage with Abu Lahab's daughter. So basically, it still happens. It's not supposed to happen according to Islamic law, but it absolutely does. That you have, I have a child who is creaking the door and has been for the last 20 minutes. So let me go yell at my child. Please shut. Sorry about that. Just
no worries.
I'm like, oh my gosh, just stop. They know what they're supposed to be doing. All right. So there's something called sister swap marriage, and it was explicitly forbidden by Muhammad. Muslims are not supposed to be doing it, but they're still doing it to this day, where two cousins, so you have a boy and a girl with one cousin and a boy and girl with the other, and the boy on one side marries the girl on the other, and the girl on that side marries the boy on the other. So you have this cross cousin marriage thing going on. And each one serves as a mahr for the other. So like, rather than actually giving a girl a bride price, instead you like give another wife to the girl's brother, right? And so this causes social problems. It did then, does now. It's forbidden. People still do it. But that meant that whenever Abu Lahab's sons sent back their Muhammad's daughters, the marriage between Zayd and Dura was also broken apart. So traditionally, it says that the source says that Ayman was married to Zayd after he was divorced in 613 to show that believing black slave women are valued enough to marry a prophet's son, because at this time Muhammad's slave Zayd had been adopted by Muhammad and was called Zayd ibn Muhammad. Right? So all this is going to be out the window, but that this is still the traditional narrative that black slave women are valued enough to be married to a prophet's son, but this does not work linearly. So she was, if she was freed, she was supposedly freed in 595 when Muhammad married Khadijah, according to this, and then he married her to, by the traditional chronology, he would have married her to a man in Medina after prophethood, and she had a son, Ayman, and she already would have been 61 to 65. And then that man dies at the Battle of Khaybar, and then she was married to Zayd, and then she has another son, Usama, after he divorced. So she's like 70 years old and having a kid. And then Ayman has to die at the Battle of Hunain, and so he's approximately 6 years old. Usama dies in a battle at the age of 3. Like, it's all very confused and messed up. So we have to figure out when these two sons, Ayman and Usama, were actually born. So Barakah had to be at least 8 to 12 years older than Muhammad. Her kunya was Ayman. That means her firstborn son has to be Ayman. It can't be Usama. She has to have Ayman first, and then she has Usama. Usama belongs to Zayd. Her second baby daddy is Zayd. Cannot be first. Very few modern women have kids after 40, and we can pretty much assume that Barakah, it'd be very unlikely that she did, right? So she had to have both sons before 610 because she would already be 48 to 52 or even older. Zayd, an important point, is only 10 years younger than Muhammad. Another one says he was only 6 years, but that seems a bit less likely. So if he marries her pretty much as soon as he's a mature adult, then that's pretty much the only way she could have had Usama, is that as soon as he was an adult, one slave is married to another slave. That happened very commonly then. Masters would marry their slaves to each other to breed more slaves, right? And then now you have Usama. So where did Ayman come from? He has to have been born into Muhammad's house before Zayd's marriage to Ayman, because he was not from Zayd. So an important point is that she was not Muhammad's wet nurse. She's called his nurse, but it's very clearly specified that she was not his wet nurse. She's way too young. She just cared for him as a child. Now notice that men controlled sexual access to their slaves. So it's possible that Muhammad at least believed that Ayman could have been his unrecognized slave son. So he was most likely, I believe, sleeping with his slave Ayman because he didn't have anyone else, and why else wouldn't he? Men were completely free to sleep with their slaves all that they wanted. So I believe that he was having intercourse with his slave, and he believed that there was at least a high likelihood that this could be his son. So the other options are that she was sexually assaulted, she had an affair, the child was from Muhammad, or Muhammad prostituted her for money. One of them. One of these things had to have happened for her to end up with the child. Muhammad kept the boy, and that's an important point. So if he was 8 years old and he didn't belong to Muhammad, he would have likely sold him for money so that he could have money to then marry someone of his desire. But yet he didn't. It's also notable that no one else bought Baraka and her son. He could have also chosen to have the boy killed if he thought it was too expensive to bring the boy up, because he was he was broke, right? So he probably suspected that this was his own son. Casting lots and soothsayers determined paternity outside of a normal marriage. So if he thought that Baraka was sleeping with other people and he's sleeping with her and he has this son, then you would normally cast lots. Also, you might cast lots for a slave's child if someone in the family does not want that person to be related to you. There was a lot of racism in the Arab society. You did not want a half-black child. You didn't want to recognize a half-black child. Blackness was considered very unattractive, and it was considered shameful to have a child from a black slave mother. So,
and we can see that through other examples of colorism in the Quran. So it talks about, for instance, that those who are going to go to hell, their face will be darkened. Those that are going to go, their face will be brightened. Muhammad in the Hadith says that the devil looks like a rugged black man, a rugged-looking black man, and also, the famous raisin head statement, which is, even if your leader is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin, still obey him. The point of the message is that even if your leader is the lowest of the low, because he's your leader, you should still obey him. But the reason why he's the lowest of the low is because he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin.
Right,
so,
exactly.
There's that kind of racial prejudice that we've got, and we could do an entire topic on that.
And there's you go to other Islamic sources and stuff from the infallible imams of Shia and stuff, and people generally recommend that you practice coitus interruptus with your black female slaves so you don't end up with a black slave child. Like, these are things that you find in classical sources because it is considered so bad. So he doesn't have much money. He doesn't have much status right now. And so it was, if the child was taken up for divining whether or not he was Muhammad's son, the diviner would have known that the correct answer to give would be no, even if Muhammad really feels in his head that this may be his son. But there is also a possibility that none of these children are actually Muhammad's. And the reason for this is that there was a tradition called wife exchanging at the time. So Muhammad may have thought that this was his son. Then he gets with Khadijah, who is very obviously fertile. She's had probably 4 kids at this point, 3 of whom have survived so far, maybe 5. Like, she gets pregnant easily, right? And no kid comes, and she's not that old, right? And so a tradition, it was kind of like, it's described oddly in the sources, but it seemed to actually be more like a kind of levirate marriage, even though you're still alive. So you would have a man, sometimes a close male relative, essentially impregnate your wife for you to give you your heirs. And that would be, you would want that to be from your own line if possible. So because Muhammad never had another child except for supposedly Mary the Copt, who randomly had a kid, and he married plenty of very fertile young women. He preferred marrying women who had barely been, are newlyweds, newly widowed, both at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And
but this was after Khadijah, so he was into his 60s. No, he was into his 50s. No,
but
no, you're right. Forget me. I'm talking rubbish. Yeah, I'm talking rubbish.
50s. So if it were his 60s, you could understand why his fertility's gone down that much. But if he has managed to have 6 kids, you don't expect him to go from 6 kids to like being completely infertile. And I've looked at different diseases that might cause later onset, because usually if men are subfertile, you start out not being very fertile. So you might have 2 kids or 3 kids over a long period of time, right? And then by the time you're 50, you can't really have any at this point. Your swimmers like decline over time. If you start out low, then it stays low. But she's popping out kid after kid after kid pretty much till she turns 40. She's almost 40 when she has Fatima. And then she doesn't have a kid for a while, and then maybe she has one more. It may be possible that, she has one more son. So, like, he's had minimum 5 kids with this woman in a fairly short period of time, probably 6. So why can't he have any kids after this? So it may be, and we also have the event of someone asking to do an exchange of wives with Muhammad. So Muhammad prohibits the wife exchange thing because he asked to do a wife exchange with Aisha is actually who this man comes up and asks him to do. That's when he explicitly forbids exchanging wives. And this makes you go, what exactly is going on here? Why is this wife exchanging thing still stewing in the background? If there is someone, I would suspect that was Abu Talib, honestly, because Muhammad doesn't marry any of his daughters to any of Abu Talib's sons, even though they have the closest relationship until considerably later. And it's kind of interesting that is going on there. So that is a possibility as well. And given his sudden, oh look, now he's totally infertile, it's a strong possibility. And by the way, Sauda was not that old because she lived many, many years after Muhammad died. They like to say, oh, Sauda, she was this old lady. No, she wasn't. She lived, her father was still alive when she married Muhammad. She was not that old. She grew to be about 40 years old whenever she was so big and fat and old, according to sweet Aisha, right? That Muhammad no longer wanted to have sex with her anymore. But she was not that old at the time of their marriage because she was not yet big and fat and old. She became big and fat and old. And again, her father was alive for her marriage. It was at the time of her marriage, she had a different person act as her official guardian for various reasons, but it had to explain why he was acting as her guardian, not her father, because her father was still alive. So, Muhammad, as I said, adopted Zayd, and this actually makes it kind of lines up more with the idea that he thought that Amen might be his own son. So by the time he adopted Zayd, he had given up having any sons of his own through Khadijah. Zayd's uncle eventually finds Zayd in Mecca, and Zayd chooses to stay with Muhammad. And the sources that we have are like this. Zayd, the youth. Zayd is 30 years old, close to 30 years old at this point. He's pretty darn old. He's not that young. He had to have been he could not have been younger than 15 when Muhammad married Khadijah when he was 25. That means Zayd was 15. Zayd had already finished doing his growing up. Whatever father figures he had, they're set. He's already 15. So if his father comes back and wants to ransom him and bring him back home, he wouldn't say, oh, but Muhammad has always been a father to me, because he hasn't. He was practically an adult when he came into Muhammad's house. But what if he already had a son who was also a slave, and his father wants to bring him back and ransom him? He's like, but I have a family here. What if Muhammad offers in return, instead of letting him be ransomed and taken back, hey, what if I adopt you as my son and free Barakah and both of her sons be counted as your sons? Then his suspected own son would become his adoptive grandson without the indignity of him having half Ethiopian son who's recognized. He could do it indirectly and bring the boy that he suspects is his actual son back into his family line, essentially. And so I find that is a more likely scenario than a man who is nearly 30 years old really wanting to be adopted by a man who's nearly 40. Like, how weird is that? Oh, you were always my father. You're 10 years older. I was basically an adult when I met you. No, you're not a father to me. Something else is happening here. So this is what my personal suspicion is. And then immediately after Zayd is adopted, then that's when the marriage arrangement is made to Dura, which then ends in divorce and probably wasn't ever, it's possible that it wasn't consummated either. Because that was give him a higher class marriage at that time. So that puts the marriages in some sort of obstetrically plausible order so that we don't have 60 and 70-year-old women giving birth to children who then fight in wars at age 3 and 6 and so on, which is what the Islamic sources had. Have Usama being an advisor to Muhammad when he's like 2 years old in the actual sources, if you look at what's supposed to happen in various lines. And Muhammad eventually falsely attributes Ayman's father or Ayman's paternity to a man in Medina after he gets there. But it's just not possible that man was his actual father after Islam. It's just completely impossible. So that is my working theory on that. So okay. I think that I'm about to wrap up with everything. Let's see. Yep, I'm wrapping up with everything. So as I said before, Surah 96 concerns reproduction and sexual prowess, and basically telling, and it may be also at this time. So we know that Hala was killed. If Hala existed, there's some debate on that. He died before Islam, and sources say that he was killed. And there's also an implication that he was killed with something having to do with Muhammad's honor. And it may be that Hala got in a fight whenever people called Muhammad names about his sexual prowess, the legitimacy of his children, the fact that he didn't have any daughters, anything like that. And then that may have also fed into the what's the word I want, the kind of tragedy, travesty, all of the stresses that Muhammad was under when he went into the cave, and then got the reassurances that don't worry, it's not that you're bad in bed. Allah has made whom he wished, or excuse me, Al-Rab, not Karalayat, Al-Rab has made whom he wishes at this time for you. And then also, here are other possibilities that might happen around this time. The earliest converts were said to be Khadijah and his daughters, except for Hinda. Hinda was not, and his daughters, not Khadijah's daughter Hinda. She was not considered to be a convert. Not 100% sure she was alive at this time, but she, given that there are some sources that give her one kid, she probably was. Zayd was supposed to be a very early convert. Ali, who was in his house, Ali ibn Talib, remember, Abu Talib went broke. Son came in love with Muhammad. Hala as well. Also Abu Rafi, whom I didn't include here, and his wife Salma, supposedly. Ibn Abbas, who was the son of his uncle Abbas, was a very early convert, along with Jafar, who was Ali's brother, who was also living with Abbas at that time. So Abbas's oldest son and Jafar living with him were also early converts. A scattering of young Qurayshi, including a daughter of Abu Sufyan, which will really annoy that Sufyan's Habiba. That's going to really build into Abu Sufyan's annoyance with Muhammad, that his daughter Habiba becomes a Muslim very early on, or a follower of Muhammad. They're not called Muslims yet either. That term doesn't exist either. Some young people, client tribes, various slave and freedmen did, but also Abu Bakr, whom we remember named his kid Abd al-Rahman before Islam and was already a monotheist and was Muhammad's best friend. Uthman and Umar both converted fairly early, and the young people under their influence were brought in too. So that concludes this big section on Muhammad, or kind of Muhammad's cultural familial background and kind of his family as it developed, and how he grew up so deprived as an orphan, probably subjected to really terrible things, how he married Khadijah and why Khadijah married him most likely, and what kind of marriage it was, what happened with their 4 daughters up until the time of Islam, and the fact that Abu Lahab, who's supposed to be the worst person ever, right? Or Abu Lahab, keep saying it wrong. Abu Lahab is supposed to be the worst person ever, and yet his sons did not have intercourse. Muhammad's prepubescent daughters, even though they shared the same house for 3 years, the more likely reasons behind his adoptions of Zayd, and the reason that Zayd would choose to be adopted by Muhammad rather than go back and be with his own father and inherit from him. How on earth Barakah could have 2 sons who fought in wars and weren't baby children, infants, and she wasn't having babies at 60 and 70. So that is kind of a start, putting things, I think, in a better order, because the Islamic sources tell anecdotes. They don't make things coherent. Things don't meld. They don't mesh. They don't make sense. There are all of these obstetrical impossibilities. People are too old. They die and then they still give birth to babies. Like weird things happen all the time in the Islamic sources, and you have to winnow through to see what is plausible and what could possibly actually have happened if Usama was a real person and was one of Muhammad's advisors. When could Zayd have had him? And that's basically what I have tried to do here.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. We very much appreciate that, and we'll close in a prayer. Laudate Dominum. Oh, praise the Lord, for it is a good thing to sing praises unto our God. Yea, a joyful and pleasant thing it is to be thankful. The Lord doth build up Jerusalem, and gather together the outcasts of Israel. He healeth those that are broken in heart, and giveth medicine to heal their sickness. He telleth the number of the stars, and calleth them all by their names. Great is our Lord, and great is his power. Yea, and his wisdom is infinite. The Lord setteth up the meek, and bringeth the ungodly down to the ground. O sing unto the Lord with thanksgiving. Sing praises upon the harp unto our God, who covereth the heaven with clouds, and prepareth the rain for the earth, and maketh the grass to grow upon mountains, and herb for the use of men, who giveth fodder unto the cattle, and feedeth the young ravens that call upon him. He hath no pleasure in the strength of an horse, neither delighteth he in any man's legs. But the Lord's delight is in them that fear him, and put their trust in his mercy. Praise the Lord, O Jerusalem. Praise thy God, O Zion. For he hath made fast the bars of thy gates, and hath blessed thy children within thee. He maketh peace in thy borders, and filleth thee with the flour of wheat. He sendeth forth his commandment upon earth, and his word runneth very swiftly. He giveth snow like wool, and scattereth the hoar frost like ashes. He casteth forth his ice like morsels. Who is able to abide his frost? He sendeth out his word, and melteth them. He bloweth with his wind, and the waters flow. He showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and ordinances unto Israel. He hath not dealt so with any nation, neither have the heathen knowledge of his laws. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Good night, guys.